Hi and welcome to this YouTube tutorial. In this video, I will teach you how to build a simple blog API using Python, Django, and Django REST framework. Before we start writing any code at all, we need to understand what an API is and what the main function is. So an API, which stands for Application Programming Interface, basically defines how two different software systems should interact with each other by specifying the types of requests and responses that can be made, as well as the format of data being transferred. So to further explain what an API is, we can look at it in the context of web development. So we can say that in the context of our web development, an API can be used to expose data and functionality from a web application to other systems. Now, these other systems can include mobile apps, other websites, or even IoT devices. Now, I'm going to give an example to fully explain what an API does. So let's say you go to a restaurant and you want to order food. Since you are the person that wants to order food, we can call you the client. Now, if we're looking at this from a programming point of view, the clients can be a mobile app, an IoT device, or even other websites. But in this scenario, you are the client. So the waiter who comes to take your order, we can look at that waiter as the API. So what you do is, when you go to a restaurant, you look at the menu and then you tell the waiter what you want to order. So the waiter then goes to the kitchen and gives your order to the kitchen. So what the kitchen does is, they prepare your meal and the waiter brings your meal back to you. So in this scenario, we can look at the waiter as the API and we can look at the kitchen as the database. So to explain this more, when a client makes a request to an API, the API takes in the request that client has made, and based on what the request is, the API goes to the database, retrieves some data, and returns a response back to the client. So in the scenario where you went to a restaurant and you requested for a particular meal from their menu, the waiter went to the kitchen and brought back your food. The food that the waiter brought back was the response that was gotten from the request that was made by the client. I hope you understood that little analogy. And another thing that we need to know is that an API is capable of accepting different requests. So what if, for example, in the same scenario, you don't want to request for food, but you want to request for like a drink, for example, like a cocktail? That is a different kind of request. If you want to request for food, you tell the waiter that you're requesting for food. But if you want to request for a drink, you tell the waiter that, okay, I want to request for a drink. This means that the waiter is capable of collecting different kinds of requests. So that is what an API basically is capable of doing. It's capable of collecting different kinds of requests, and then based on those kinds of requests, it returns different kinds of responses based on what request has been made to the API. So as we build on, that was a very long intro, sorry for that. As we build on, you are going to fully understand the main functionalities of an API. So I want you to sit back, and if you have any question about whatever I say in this tutorial, you can leave a question in the comment section and I will reply you immediately. There are also going to be timestamps where you can skip ahead if you already understand what is going on. And if you want to get the full code to this course, there's going to be a link in the description that will take you to my GitHub where you can get all this code. So let us begin. So in this next stage, we need to start setting up the project. I am going to assume you have some understanding on Django and you understand how to set up a Django project. So right now, what I am going to do is set up this Django project. So the first thing I'll do is make a directory where I want this project to be. So I'm going to mkdir, and I'll call this folder blog API tutorial. So once I do that, I'll cd into this folder. Now I am going to create a virtual environment, and I create virtual environments by using the pipm shell command. If you have a special way of creating your virtual environment, you can go ahead. But for me, I use pipenv. And if you want to follow my step, the first thing you need to do is actually install this library. So you run the command pip install pipenv. Now, once you run this, it will install it for you. Because I already have it installed, it says requirement already satisfied. So the next thing that you need to do is run the command pipenv shell. Now, this is going to create a virtual environment for us. And immediately it creates it, it activates the virtual environment, as you can see here. Now, the name that it gives this virtual environment is the name of your current working directory where the environment was created. If I say pwd, you see that I am inside the folder called blog API tutorial, and the name of my virtual environment is blog API tutorial, right? So we can see that we're currently inside the virtual environment. If you would like to exit it, just type exit and you'll see that you have been exited. And if you would like to reactivate this virtual environment, you just simply run the command pipenv shell once again, and it will reactivate that virtual environment. Right, now that we've gotten that out of the way, the next step that we need to take is install Django. So just run pip install Django. And then once that has installed, we need to install another library, which is Django REST framework. So I'm going to say pip install Django REST framework. Now, once you run that, it's installing Django REST framework for us. So now we've installed Django and Django REST framework. The next thing we need to do is create a project, a Django project. So I'm going to run the command django-admin start project, and I will call this project blog API. Blog API. So once I run that and I say ls, you can see that a folder called blog API has been created. So we're going to cd into blog API. And then we now need to create an application. So I'm going to run the command python manage.py start app, and I will call this blog API, blog API app. Now, once I say ls, you can see we have been provided with the app folder, which is blog API, and the projects folder, which is the projects folder, which is blog API, and the app folder, which is blog API app. Now, the next thing we need to do is open this folder that we're currently in, blog API. We need to open it in Visual Studio Code. So I am going to navigate my way and open my code editor, or whatever code editor you choose to use. And I will open this directory. So I'm going to go to desktop, YouTube, tutorial, blog API tutorial, and I will open this folder. So right now, this should be your folder structure, your manage.py, your app folder, and your projects folder. So the reason why I'm just running through this project setup is that I expect that you have some understanding on Django. So the next thing we need to do is register our blog API app in the settings.py file. So just come over here and we're going to register it, blog API app. And we also need to register REST framework because we have installed REST framework and we need to let Django know that we have this library installed. So we're going to say REST underscore framework. Yes. So after doing that, the next thing that we need to do is we need to configure the URLs. So I am going to go to my app folder and create a file called urls.py, urls.py. And at the top, I'll say from django.urls import path. So this is FROM. So from django.urls import path. Now, the reason why we're getting this error is because we haven't selected the right environment. So I'm just going to come over here to this place where you have what Python version it is using. Click it and search for whatever virtual environment has been created or whatever virtual environment you are working in. So I'm working in this one, so I'm going to click it. Now the next thing we need to do is create a URL patterns list. So we are doing this just so that we can have the URLs, so that we can have a URLs routing file inside our app folder and not have to do everything inside the URL in our projects folder. So I'm just going to import include here so that we can tell Django to include the URLs file inside the app folder. So I'm going to say path, and I'm going to leave the actual path empty because I want this URL to point towards the home page. And I'll say include, and inside this include, in quotes, I'm going to pass in blog API app.urls. So I'm just trying to tell Django to go into the app folder and take note of all the URL patterns that are created inside the app folder. So let's save that and close everything. So the next step that we now need to do is we actually now need to run our server to make sure that our project is working properly. So I am going to go back to my terminal and I will run the command python manage.py run server. Now, once I run this, a local development server will be given to us. So just copy that. Sorry. So just copy, let me copy this. So just copy that URL, go to whatever browser that you are using. Let me close this up and paste that URL. So once you paste it, you can see that this is showing. It says the install worked successfully. Congratulations. So we can see right now that our project is working properly and the setup was successful. So the next step that we now need to take is we need to create a view just to return something. We need to create an API endpoint, a view, just to return something. Okay, now let me actually explain what API endpoints are. At the beginning of this video, when I was explaining an API, I told you that an API is capable of receiving different kinds of requests depending on it's capable of receiving different kind of requests. Now, these requests depend on what endpoints are available. And I gave you the scenario of a client asking for a drink and also asking for food. Now, that drink in a programmatic sense is an endpoint, and the food which the client wants to order is also a different endpoint. So different requests can be made to different endpoints in an API. So an API must have multiple endpoints for clients to actually be able to make a request to those endpoints. Now, each API endpoint receives different kinds of requests and returns different kinds of data. Now, as we go on, you are going to understand more about API endpoints. So for now, we're going to create our first API endpoint. And in order to do that, we need to import two libraries. So the first library we need to import is what we call the API view. So just say from REST framework.decorators import import API view. So once we do that, the next library that we need to import is response. So say from REST framework.response import response, and you are going to see how we need these libraries. So when you want to create an API, when you want to create an API endpoint, and that is you want to create a view for this endpoint, the first thing you need to specify is what kind of HTTP request methods this endpoint receives. That is, are we trying to make an endpoint that receives a GET request or a POST request? Now, don't worry about this. You are going to understand more as we progress. So the endpoint we must first declare what kind of HTTP request method this endpoint accepts. Since we just want to display in these endpoints that we're creating now, we will just want to display like setup was successful. What that means is that anytime we visit this endpoint, it's a GET request we are trying to make to this endpoint. So I'm going to say at API view, and I'm going to create parentheses right here. And inside the parentheses, just create a list. Now it is in this list that you can declare the different kinds of request methods that this API endpoint can take. So I'm just going to type get because I only want the client to be able to just request for this endpoint. That is only a get request. So now we are also going to talk about different kinds of requests as we progress. So I'm going to call this I'm going to call this endpoint or this view index, and this will take in request. Now what we're simply going to return is I'm just going to return response, RETURN, return response, and inside this parenthesis I will just pass in sorry inside this parenthesis I'll just pass in success. Then in quotes I'll say the setup was successful. So let's save that. Now, after creating this endpoint, this view, we need to obviously create a URL for this particular view. So I'll just zoom in here so you can see properly. So I'm just going to create the URL. But before we can create the URL, we have to import our views.py file. So I will say from dot import views. So from dot means from this present folder, I want you to import the views file. So dot is just referring to the current folder. So after doing that, I'm just going to create a URL and I'll say path, and I'll leave this empty because I want this URL to serve as the base URL, the home page. And I'll say views, V-I-E-W-S, views.index, and I'll just put a comma here. So once you save that, we can simply go back to the browser and refresh. And when you refresh, what do we have? You see that we have an error saying no such table, Django sessions. Now, the reason why we are getting this error is because if you look at the terminal, you can see that we haven't made our migrations. If we scroll to the top, when we run our server, it gave us some errors saying you have 18 unapplied migrations. So in order to get rid of this error, what you simply need to do is run make migrations and migrate. So we say python manage.py make migrations, and after doing that we say python manage.py migrate. So once we run that and we run our server once again, you can see that that error that was showing has been removed. And when we go back to the web browser and refresh, what do you have? You can see that the error is gone and we have been returned to this beautiful page that Django has given us right off the bat. And what can you notice here? It says success. The setup was successful. So right now, if you go back to the code, we can see that we were able to return a response successfully, and we were also able to request this endpoint from the browser successfully. So notice that we use the browser to make this GET request to our endpoint. Now, we are going to need to switch to something else, which is called Postman. When you are building APIs and you want to test your API, we can do it in two ways. We can write code to actually test the API, or we can use another software called Postman. So let me just search it up in the browser, and I'll search Postman. Now, Postman it's just an API platform for developers to design, build, and test and iterate their APIs. So basically, it's a platform that we can use to test our APIs as we are um, building it. So I want you to download Postman. Hit this link right here. I want you to download Postman, and you are going to need to sign up. Yeah. So just download the software on your computer based on whatever operating system you are using. It's available for Windows and Microsoft. I am not sure if it's available for Linux, but if it is, just download it and install it. So the next step we're going to take is I'm going to show you how we can make a request to these API endpoints that we have created in two ways. So the first way is I like to just write this in the test.py file. So we need to download a library, sorry, we need to install a library called requests because we're going to be using this library to make a request to our API. You know, normally, if you are trying to interact with an API in Python, you need to use the requests library. So I'm going to head over to the terminal and I'm going to break out of it. And I'll run the command pip install requests. So once you run this, it will just install the request library for us inside our virtual environment. So after doing that, just run your server again and head back to your code editor. Now in here, I'm going to just say import request and I'm going to come down and I will say request is equals to requests dot get, and all we need to pass into this URL the um is the URL is the endpoint URL endpoints that we are trying to hit. So I will go back to my code editor, sorry, my browser, and copy this base URL, which is the homepage endpoint, and I will paste it in here. So what I will now simply say is print request.json. So I will save this and I will run this code in my terminal. Let's clear out the terminal and run this code. So once we run this code, you can see that it is returning something back to us. Success, the setup was successful. Now, this is one way of interacting with our API, of testing our API. But I will not be using this way because it's stressful. Because you have to write code to make requests to each endpoint that we create. So the other way that we are going to use is Postman. Now, that is why I told us to install Postman. So let's just again copy this URL and close this test.py. Now, I want you to go and open your Postman and it should look something like this. So we need to create a new tab, and in this new tab, since this API endpoint only accepts a GET request, we are going to make a GET request to this endpoint and we should see success, setup was successful. So inside this tab here, just paste the URL. And then here, we can select what kind of request we're trying to make to the API. Since it's a GET request, just select GET. And all you have to do is hit send. Now, once you hit send, you can see that we are getting a response back saying success, the setup was successful. So right now, we are going to be using Postman to test our APIs. So we have successfully created the first endpoint, and this endpoint only accepts a GET request. The reason why it's only a GET request is because anytime you actually visit any URL in your browser and the browser displays like a page, what you're actually doing is you are making a GET request to the server to get that HTML file so that it can be displayed to you. So anytime you visit a website, you're actually making a GET request to the server to view like the HTML file or to view the front end. So anytime you visit the URL, it's a GET request. So that is why we only specified a GET request here. So right now, we now need to start creating, we need to advance. And the next step in this project is we need to create our models. Now remember that we are making an API for a blog website. Therefore, we need a way to be able to store these APIs. Sorry, we need a way to be able to store data inside our database. So the next step we'll take is head over to our models.py file. And in here, we need to configure our database and we need to save what kind of data can be, we need to configure what kind of data can be saved in this database and how it can be saved. So we're going to create a model called post. And this is going to inherit from models.model. So this post model is going to have two fields. The first field is title, and it's going to be a models or character field, and the max length is going to be 200. And the next field is going to be content. Now, this content is equated to a models or text field because it is where the actual content of the blog is going to be saved. So we just need to save this models.py file. The next thing that we need to do is now register these models in our admin.py file so that we can actually view this model in the admin dashboard that Django is going to provide us. So let's go to the admin.py file, and then at the top here, we're going to say from dot import models. And all we simply need to do to register this model in the admin is say admin.site.register, and inside parentheses, I'll pass in models post. So after doing that, all we need to do is just save this admin file. Then we need to create a super user. So head over to your terminal. We're creating a super user because we would like to access the admin dashboard. So let's break out of this terminal, and let me clear the screen. So run the command python manage.py create super user. So it's going to ask us for a username. I'll type in admin. I will leave the email empty, and I'll type in my password. I'll type in the password again. Okay, it said it didn't match, and I'll say yes. So you can see that the super user has been created for us. Now we also need to take note of something. Remember that we had created a model. So what we need to do is make migrations and migrate. The reason why we need to make migrations is because we need to prepare the database for changes to be made to it, because we're trying to create new tables and new columns in database. So make migrations is going to prepare the database for these changes. So I'm going to head back to the terminal and run python manage.py make migrations. So once I do that, you can see it's creating, it said create model post. So what we now simply need to do is migrate these changes. So I'm going to say python manage.py migrate. So it's going to save those changes to the database. So let's clear out the screen and run our server. So once we run the server, we can simply go back to our browser. I'm going to create a new tab, and I'm going to /admin, which is the admin dashboard. And I'll log in with the details that I had created earlier. So when I log in, you can see that we'll have this posts model already showing. So let's just create a few posts right now. So I'm going to say first blog, and in the content I'll say this is my first blog post on this website. So let's save and add another. So I'm going to create another one and say second second post, and in here I'll just say this is my second blog post on this Django websites. Right, so let's save that. So right now we have two posts, but notice that it says post object 1 and post object 2, but we want to view the title, the actual title of this post, instead of the admin dashboard just returning this object name to us. So we can head back to the models.py file, and we can create a string method here, def __str __self, and then we can return the title of each post so that we can actually view the title. So you can head over to the admin dashboard and refresh. And once you refresh, you can see that it's the title of each blog that gets returned back to us. So right now, we have successfully created the models and we have added two blog posts to the dashboard. So what we now need to do is we need to create an endpoint that is going to ask the API for all the blogs in the website. So again, I'll use a scenario. What if I already have a blog website where I have like 10 blogs and I am trying to create a mobile app for my blog? So what I can now simply do is create an endpoint where the mobile app can request to the endpoint, and the endpoint will simply return all the blogs on the website. So we are going to do that right now. So what we need to do is go to our views.py file, and we are going to need to create this view, which is going to be mapped to the endpoint. So what we now need to say is first declare what kind of requests that this endpoint can receive. So since the client is only going to be requesting for data from this endpoint and not actually sending anything, that is not actually posting any data, it's going to only receive a HTTP method of get. So I'm going to now create the endpoints right here below, and I'll name the URL. Sorry, I'll name the function get all posts. So I'll say get all posts, and I'll pass a request here. And for now, let's pass. So what we now need to do is register this view that we just created in the URL. Now, we also need to understand that each URL that we create represents the different kinds of endpoints that our API has. So I'm going to create a new URL, and I will just, in quote, I'll just say get all blogs, or let me say get all posts. And I'll put a comma, and I'll say here, I'll pass in views dot get all posts and put a comma there. So anytime the client wants to make a request to this endpoint, all the client has to do is go to the base URL / get all posts, and it is going to when the client goes to this URL, it is going to return to the client all the blog posts on our website. So we're getting an error right now because it didn't return anything, and that is normal. So what we are going to need to do is go back to our views.py file, and we need to import this model class, this post class right here into our views.py file. So I'm going to go to the top, and I'll say from .models import post. So what we now simply need to do next is that we need to go to the database and get all the posts in a database. So what I'm just going to say is get posts, create a variable named get posts, and I equate this to post.objects.all. So here we are just going through a database to get every single post that is inside the database. So we're just going to say return response, and in here I'll pass in get post. Now we are going to get an error for just passing in get post like this into the response class, but let's just try this and see what error it gives us. So let's make this request from Postman. So I'm going to create a new tab, and I'm going to copy this base URL. And since we created the endpoint to be / get all posts, I am going to put that / get all posts into Postman. Now, since it's a get request that we are trying to make, that the endpoint only accepts, I'm going to select get. And once I send this, you'll notice that it's going to give us an error, but we can't really visualize the error here. So let's click preview. So you can see that it says page not found. Okay, it's telling us that it does not recognize this page. So let's go back to the URL to make sure that it is set up properly. So let's put a forward slash here and go back and try to send this again. So now we're getting a different error saying type error get all post object of type post is not JSON serializable. So to see this error properly, let's just visit this endpoint inside the browser. So I'm going to say forward slash get all posts. So you can see it says object of type post is not JSON serializable. So the reason why we are getting this error is from this line right here, line 14. Now, the reason why we're getting this error is because the response class cannot return this query set just like that, because it is too complex a data type for the response class to send as a response to the client. Now, if you look up here, earlier we were just able to send this dictionary that just says success, the setup was successful. The reason why this didn't give an error is because a dictionary is a simple data type that the response class can return, but the response class cannot return a query set, because it's like trying to return a list of objects back to the client, and it is just a complex data type, and it cannot just right off the bat return all these query sets. So how do we solve this issue? We now need to create serializers. Now, serializers serve as a middleman between the actual query set and the response class. So the serializer takes in the query set and converts it into a data type or a format that the response class can handle. So you are going to see how this works. So I want you to go to your, oops, I mistakenly closed my code editor. Sorry about that. So I'm just going to open this. Okay, blog API. Yes, so right now, the next step that we need to take is we need to go to the app folder right here, and then we need to create a file called serializers. So just create a file called serializers, serializers, serializers.py inside your app folder. So once you do that, the next step we need to take is we need to import something. So we need to say from REST framework dot serializers import model serializer. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create a serializer class for this post model. So just write this code with me. I will explain exactly what it's doing. So just say class post serializer, serializer, post serializer, and this will inherit from model serializer, which we imported at the top. So the next thing we need to do is say class meta, and we need to define what model it is, and this is post. So we need to import this post model at the top. So I'm going to say from dot models import post. Then the next thing we need to do is specify the fields that we want to serialize, and I will say all. Right, so let me explain what is going on here. So remember I told you that in order to be able to return all these objects, that is all the posts in database, we need to create a serializer, which is a middleman. So the serializer, which is what we just created here, we need some things to be specified. We need to specify the model which we are trying to serialize, and then we need to specify the fields from this model which will be included in the process. So the model that we are trying to serialize is the post model. Now we need to also define what fields in this post model we are going to be working with in this serializer. Since we will be trying to, or since we will be working with both title and content, we are going to just specify all. This dunder, this underscore, then all, and double underscores. The double underscore is just dunder. So it's dunder all, then dunder. So this is the serializer that we're going to be creating. Now, what we now need to do is we need to import this serializer that we created into our views.py file. So let's do that. We'll say from .serializers import post serializer. So instead of just returning response here, we are going to come down after this gets post and create another variable called serializer. Now you can call this variable whatever you want, but I want to call it serializer. So I'm going to call the post serializer class that we just created. And inside this parentheses, I am going to pass in get posts. So I'll just copy that and paste it here. And then in the response class, instead of returning get posts, I'm going to return serializer. I'll return serializer.data. So let's explain what is going on here. First of all, this endpoint goes and gets all the posts in database, and then it passes in all those posts that it has gotten, all those objects. It passes it into the post serializer class. So all that data comes here, and then all that data is then converted to a format that is suitable and can be used by the response class. So after it has converted it, we now pass in serializer here dot data. That is, we want you to pass in, we want to pass in the serialized data into this response class so that it can be returned. And it's typically going to be returned in JSON format. So instead of passing in these query sets directly into the response class, we just passed it into the serializer class, and the serializer class converted it into a data type that is not too complex for the response class to return as a response. So right now, if you do not understand what I just said, you can leave a question in the comment section and I will be happy to reply you immediately. The next step we now need to take is we need to test these endpoints to see if it works. So the URL that we created for it was get all posts. And if we head over to Postman, we can now try to see if this endpoint works properly. So again, we're making a GET request to this URL, which is the endpoint. And when we hit send, we are still getting an error, get all posts. So let's try to visualize what that error is in the browser. It says original query set has no attribute title. And so the reason why we got that error is because we were supposed to pass in something else into this post serializer. We're supposed to pass in many equals true. Now, the reason why we need to pass in many equals true into this post serializer is because we need to tell Django that we're trying to pass in a query set, a list of objects, and not just one item. Because right now, when we didn't specify many equals true, the serializer was expecting that we return just one, that is, gets just one item, but it got multiple items because we wrote a query to get all the posts in the database. So we need to specify many equals true to let it know that it is that we are passing in a query set, that is a list of objects, into the serializer. So once we do that and we head over to Postman and we try to send this GET request again, you can see that our code is working perfectly well. And if I zoom in, you can see that this blog post has been returned back to us. We have the first blog, which is first blog, and the content is this is my first blog on the website. And we have the second blog also being returned back to us. And if we try to visit these endpoints in our browser and we refresh, you can see that this data is being returned back to us. So our code is working perfectly well, and we've successfully created an endpoint that returns all this data back to the client. So if this was like my mobile app, for example, now, my mobile app could have used this data and displayed all this content inside the app itself so that I didn't have to manually put it into the app. I could just make a request from the app to the API and this content will be returned back to us. So now we're going to create a different endpoint. Now the next endpoint that we're going to create is going to be responsible for creating blog posts. What if I wanted to create a new blog post from the client, that is from the mobile app? What if I didn't want to have to go to the admin dashboard and manually create it from the dashboard? What if I wanted to create this blog post from the mobile app or the client? We can do that and we can create another endpoint. So what we need to specify first, as usual, is what request method this endpoint is going to allow. So we're going to say at API view, at API underscore view, I will create parentheses. And in here, we're going to pass in two request methods, which are get and post. So because we will be expecting data from the API, we need to pass in like a get request, and we also need to pass in a post request because we will need to send this new blog data to this endpoint. So you are going to see exactly why. So I'm going to say I'm going to create this view and I'll call it create post and I'll pass in request. And after doing that, we're just going to say pass for now. We now need to create a URL for this view. We need to map that particular view to a URL so we can create the endpoint here, the URL endpoint. So I'm going to call this path create a new post. And after doing that, I'll say views dot create post, and I'll put a comma at the end. So after we've done this, now we have successfully created a URL endpoint for this particular view. So what we now need to do next is that we need to start writing code into this view. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to get the post ID. So the way this view is going to work is like this. Obviously, since this endpoint is just meant for creating a post, it means that we are going to get data from this post request coming in, which means that when the client hit send, that is when the client wants to add a new post, it's going to send data to this endpoint, which is like the title of the blog post and the content. So we need to grab that data that is coming in from this post request. So we can do that by saying data is equals to request dot data. So what we are essentially just doing here is that we are trying to grab all the data that the user or the client has sent in that post request. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to pass this data into the post serializer to validate whether this data is if the data is the correct if the data is correct rather. So I'm going to say serializer equals post serializer, and then we're going to say data is equals to this data right here, because we would like to check if this data is correct. That is, if the client has actually sent a title and content and not something else, because the clients could send any other kind of data. But if the data that the client sends doesn't match the data that this post model is capable of saving, then obviously we need to show an error. So in order to do this validation, we need to pass that data into the post serializer. So what we can now do is we can write a conditional right here to say if serializer dot is valid. So let me just write that step by step. If serializer dot is underscore valid, that is, if the data that has been sent in this post request is valid, then we just need to save this serializer. So we're going to say serializer dot save. So what this is going to do is that it is going to take all that data and save it to the database after it has done this validation. So after saving that data, we just need to return a response. And inside this response, we're just going to return a dictionary and say success. The post was successfully created. And we're just going to put a comma here and pass in a status code of 201. So anytime a new blog post has been added successfully from this API endpoint, the response that is going to be sent is success. The post was created successfully, and a status code of 201. The status code of 201 basically means that the post request was successful and something was created successfully from this post request. We can search it up right now. Status code 201, and then you can see that it says the HTTP 201 created success status. Status response code indicates that the request has succeeded and has led to the creation of a resource. So that is why I returned the status code 201. So what if the data wasn't valid? We need to return an error. So we're going to say else return response serializer dot errors. So this is simply what we need to do, and then we can pass in a status code of, let's say, 400, which stands for bad request. So if the serializer, if the data is valid, it's going to save that data and return a success response. But if it isn't valid, it's going to return the errors that will be automatically generated for us from this serializer, and it's going to return a status code of 400, which means bad request. So now we've written all this code. We now actually need to test to see if this endpoint is working properly. So we can head over to Postman. But before we do that, we need to take note of the URL, and it is create new post. This is the URL endpoint. So let's copy that and head over to Postman. So we can create a new tab right here. Now take note of this, that at this point there are only 2 blog posts in this in our database. From this new request that we are going to make, this post request, we are going to add a new blog post via this request that we will make. So because we want to send data to this endpoint, we are going to say post. So I will copy this base URL, paste it in here, and it's going to be / the URL endpoint for creating a new post. So I'm going to just paste that there. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to now actually declare some parameters. If we go back to the code and we go back to the models, you'll notice that the model requires 2 fields, which are title and content. So in this views.py file, anytime we say request.data, we're actually trying to find the title and content that will be sent from this post request. So in order to do that, we need to go back to Postman and go to body. And under body, select form data. And under form data, we need to specify the title. And I will say third, THIR, the third blog. And the next field we need to specify is content. We are saying title and content again because in the views, or rather in the models.py file, we have these fields, title and content. So let's make sure we save the URL. So after doing that, let's just head back to Postman. And for the content, I am going to say this is a blog post that was added from Postman. Now, this is a moment of truth. All we simply need to do is hit send. Now, once we hit send, you can see that we get a success message saying the post was added, was successfully created. And you can see that the status we get is 201 created. Now, how do we actually know that this data was created and saved in the database? We can simply come back to this get request that simply gets all the posts in the database. And when we make this request again, you can see that a third blog has been added. And what does it say? The title is third blog, and the content is, this is a blog post that was added from Postman. Exactly what we had sent in this post request. And to further prove that this data was saved, if we come back to the admin dashboard and refresh, you can see that that exact um, blog post was added. And if we click it, you can see the exact contents that we added from the from Postman that is being displayed here. So right now, our endpoint works successfully, and we've successfully created 3 endpoints. The first endpoint is just to return a success message. The second endpoint, which is to get all the posts in database, and then the third endpoint, which helps us create new posts and save to the database. So let's say, for example, we don't enter valid data and we enter like wrong data. Let's see what error is going to give us. So let's go back to this endpoint and let's spell content wrong. Let's just say con. So let's try to send this so you can see that it shows an error saying content, this field is required. So this gave an error, right? We gave an error, and that error came from this line because the data that was sent wasn't valid. It was expecting a title and content, but in the request that we sent title and con. It now gave an error which came from here, and if we go back, it said content, this field is required. So you can see that an error was automatically generated for us from the serializer. So we can just change this back to content. So we can see that our code is working perfectly well. Now we've successfully created a view to get all the posts, and endpoints to get all the posts, and another endpoint to create a post. But what if we wanted to delete a post? We wanted to create an endpoint where we could delete posts from the client. For example, we could delete a post from the mobile app. We can simply create another API endpoint to do that. And then the HTTP request method that we are going to be making use of here is delete. So I'm going to say at API_view, and I'll create parentheses in here, and I'll create a list. And the only HTTP request method I'll pass in here is delete, because we will be trying to delete a blog post. So I'm just going to say dev delete delete post, and this will collect requests. So let's just say pass for now, and let's map this view to a URL. So I'm going to come to the URLs, and I'll create a new URL endpoint, and I'll call it delete post, and I'll pass in views.delete post because we are trying to map the delete post view to a URL. So let's now talk about how exactly this delete post view is going to, this delete post view is going to work. So let's say for example, we wanted to delete this first blog right here. Oh, okay, we need to save this view. Let's make sure the server is running. Okay, it's running. So let's refresh this browser. So let's say we wanted to delete this first blog. What we are simply going to need to do is we are going to need the ID of that particular blog. And then using the ID of that particular blog, we will be able to delete it. So right now, what we can do is first create a variable that is going to collect the ID of this blog. So in the delete request that is going to be made from the client is also going to need to send the ID of this particular blog that it is trying to delete. So I'm going to create a variable, and I will say post underscore ID, and I will equate that to request dot data dot get, and inside this parenthesis I'll pass in post ID. So you are going to see how this is going to work, but just work with me and follow me. So after getting the ID of the particular post that we would like to delete, the next step that we now need to take is that we need to get this particular post from the database. So I'm going to say post is equals to post.objects.get ID is equals to post ID. So using this particular ID that the user has specified in the delete request that the client that the post ID that the client has specified in this delete request, we can now get the particular post in database using this query. So after getting it, what we can simply say is post.delete. And after deleting this post, we can just return a response saying the post was successfully deleted and a status code of 200. Now, what if the ID that the user, or sorry, that the client sent does not exist in the database? We can now use a try and except block to we can use a try and except block to stop our server from crashing. So what we can say here is try, and we can push all this code into this try block. So this is going to try and see if this post with this particular ID actually exists in database. And if it does, it's going to delete that post and return a response. But if it doesn't exist, so we're going to say except post dot does not exist. That is, except that particular model that we are trying to delete, that particular post model that we're trying to delete does not exist, then we're going to return a response saying error, the post does not exist, and then we'll return a status code of 404. The 404 status code means error not found. So that should be all the code that we need to write inside this delete post view right here in endpoint API endpoints right here. So what we can now simply do is we can test these API endpoints to see if it works. So we need to take note of the URL, and the endpoint URL is delete post. So let's go back to Postman to see if this endpoint actually works. So I'll copy again this base URL, and I'll put a /delete delete dash post /, and here in the request method I'm just going to select delete. Now remember that I said this endpoint is expecting that the client sends the ID of the post that he is trying to delete, or that it is trying to delete, I mean. If we go back to Postman and we go to the get request, since we want to delete this first blog post and we know the ID is 1, we can simply go back to this our delete request and hit body, and in the form data we'll specify post underscore ID is going to be 1. The reason why we pass in post underscore ID as the key is because in the views.py file in here we told this to check for a value that has a placeholder of post underscore ID. If this was post identification, we would also make this post identification. So now that we've done that, let's just hit send, and you can see that it returns a success message saying the post was successfully deleted. And in order to be sure that the post was deleted, when we go to this get request, that's request for all the posts in database, when we hit this endpoint again, you can see that that first blog isn't there anymore. It has been deleted. And if we head over to the admin dashboard, when we go to the posts, you can also see that that first blog has been deleted. So our code is working perfectly well. So this section of the try block works. So what if the post does not exist it should return the error, this post does not exist. That is, if we return a post ID that does not exist, it should give us an error saying the post does not exist. So let's try that. And in the Postman, inside this request, under the delete post URL, if we pass in like 7 as the ID, because no post with the ID 7 exists, it should give us an error. So let's send this request. And you can see it says error, the post does not exist. So right now we have written an API endpoint that is capable of deleting a particular post using the ID, using the post ID of that post. And this endpoint works perfectly. Now we're also going to create another API endpoint. Now this endpoint is going to help us view the details of one particular blog post. What if instead of just retrieving all the blog posts in database, what if you just wanted to retrieve one particular blog in the entire database? Now we can do that, and it is similar to the delete post endpoint. So I'm just going to create that endpoint, and then the HTTP request method is going to be get. So I'll say at API underscore view, and in here I will pass in get, because we are trying to get that particular post. Now I'm going to create this view, and I'll call it get post, and I'll pass a request here. So I'll say pass for now. So we need to map this view to a URL. So just go to the urls.py file, and in the path, we are going to create a URL endpoint called delete-post. And we're going to map it to views.getPost. And we'll put a comma after that. So now that we have created this API endpoint, we now need to actually write code that is going to retrieve every particular, that's going to retrieve a particular blog post. Now, because it works similar to the delete post endpoint, I will just copy everything in here, but we're going to make some changes to it. So I am going to say, get post request or data. So we're also trying to get the particular blog post by the ID of that blog post. Then I will try to get that particular blog post from the database. And instead of deleting this blog post, what we need to do is we need to return this blog post back as the response. Now remember that I said we can't just return that query set as it is as a response. That is, we can't just return posts as a response because it's too complex a data type for the response class to handle. So what we're simply going to do here is we're going to create a serializer here, and we'll equate this to post serializer, and we're going to pass in post into this serializer class. Now, because we're only retrieving one item from a database, there is no need to pass in many equals true. The reason why we are not passing it in is because we are only specifying that we are retrieving just one item from the database, and then we want to pass just that one item into the serializer. Unlike at the top, here, where we needed to specify that it's more than one item that we're passing into the serializer. So after doing that, all we simply need to do is, instead of returning post, we're going to return serializer.data. Now this is going to work if the post ID that the client sent exists. If a post in the database that has the ID that the client sent exists, but if it doesn't work, it's going to return an error saying error, the post does not exist. So we have created this endpoint called delete post. What we now simply need to do is test that endpoint. Sorry, instead of delete post, let's call it get post. My bad. That's a mistake. So instead of calling it delete post, let's call it get post. So now this is the endpoint called get-post. Let's now test it in Postman. So we'll create a new tab, and it's going to be a get request. So I will copy this base URL and I will paste it in here, and it's going to be /get dash post. So what we now need to do again is that we need to specify the ID of the particular post that we want to get. So we go to body, select form data, and here we're going to pass in post underscore ID. And for the ID, let's say we wanted to get the details of this second post. What we simply need to do is just come here and pass in 2, since it has an ID of 2. So let's send this request, and when we send it, you can see that it returns back to us the details of this particular blog post. It returns the ID, the title, and the content. So, but if we now specify a blog post that doesn't exist, like let's say 9, you can see it gives us an error saying error, this post does not exist. So you can see that our endpoint is working perfectly well. There is also something that I would like to bring your attention to in the serializers.py file. If we go back to the serializers file, remember that I said if we want to specify what fields we are working with, we can just specify it here. So instead of passing in all, if we wanted to just only work with the title, we would remove this all and create a list or a tuple and pass in title right here. So it's only going to serialize fields for the title, and it's going to ignore content as if it doesn't exist. So it's only going to serialize for title. So if you want to do for all the fields, you just simply type in all. Alternatively, you can also create another serializer, but I don't think that's the best practice. You can also create a serializer and call it like post serializer 2. And instead of specifying all the fields, you will just pass in a list and let us say content. So right now, content has its own personal serializer. So this serializer, post serializer 2, is only going to serialize the content field and ignore the title field. But this isn't best practice. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, we have successfully created our API endpoint to get all posts, to create posts, to delete posts, and to get a particular post. So we have created endpoints that performs the basic CRUD operations, which are create, delete, update. Oh yeah, we haven't created an endpoint to update. So we can do that right now. What if we wanted to create another endpoint to edit a particular blog post? We can do that right now. So we're going to create a new API endpoint, and this is going to just accept one API. It's going to accept one HTTP request method, and it's going to be called put API underscore view. And then inside this list, we're going to pass in put. The put HTTP request methods is used to update existing data inside the database. So that's where we're saying put. So I'm going to create a new function called update post. As usual, I'll leave it empty for now. And I am going to create a URL for it. So I'll say path. And in here, I will pass in update post as the URL, as the URL endpoint, and the function will be views.updatePost. So we now need to head back to this view, and it's going to work almost like the get post also, in the sense that anytime the client wants to update a particular post, it's obviously going to need the ID of that post in order to edit the content, in order to get the post and edit the content of that post. So I'm just going to copy this line right here, and I'll paste it here. So the client is going to need to send the ID of the post that it is trying to update. So after doing that, we also now need to get the specific data. Sorry, get the specific model from the database that it is trying to update. So since we are getting this ID, we also now need to write a try and except block right here. So I'm just going to write try, and we need to write a try block to try and get this particular post to see if it exists in database. And if it exists in the database, we're going to write some code. So let me just write an except block to remove this error. Except post that does not exist. We're going to say the post does not exist. That is, if the post does not exist. So right here, after getting the post, since we want to update it, we now also need to get the title and the content, because when the client is trying to update this post, the client will either try to update the title or try to update the content, or even try to update both. So what we need to do is we need to specify the title and the content right here, just as we had specified the post ID, because the client is going to need to send the post ID, the title if the client is trying to update the title, or the content if the client is trying to update the content. So I will call this get new title, and it's going to be equals to, oh sorry, this is supposed to be an underscore. It's going to be equals to request dot data dot get, and in here I'll pass in new title, and I'll do the same thing to say get new content is going to be equals to request dot data dot get new content. Now the only way data will be returned back to these variables is if the client actually sends new data containing new title. That's sorry, the only way data will be returned back to this variable is if the client actually sends a new title and new content for this particular post ID. Now the ID of the post cannot be updated, because every single post that is created has a unique ID and it cannot be changed. So after doing this, we now need to write a conditional here to check if there is actually a new title and if there is a new content, if a new content for this blog post has been sent. So we're going to say if get new title, if get new title, then we are going to say post dot title is equals to get new title. Just follow me and I will explain why we're doing this. And I'll also say if get new content, then I'll say post dot content is equals to get new content. And after doing all that, I'll just say post dot save and return a response saying the post was successfully updated. Right. So let me explain what is happening here. So first of all, the user is going to send the ID. So, and it's going to send the ID. So the program is going to get the ID that the user has sent here. Then the next thing that the program is going to do is it's going to try to get the title and the content. That is, if a new title and a new content has been sent along with the ID in this update post API endpoint, it's going to get the title and the content here, and it's going to save those values to these variables. So the program is now going to come to this try block. It's going to try to get a post that has the ID of whatever the user has, whatever the client rather has entered. And then if the client sends a new title, it's going to update the title, the current title of the blog post right in this line. It's going to update the current title to whatever the client sent in the put request. And if there is a new content, it's also going to update the content of the, it's going to update the current content of this blog post that the client has sent. It's going to replace it with what the client sent in this put request. And after all that, it is going to be saved in the database. Those changes will be saved to the database, and a response of success is going to be returned back to uh, the client. So else, if the post does not exist, it's simply going to return an error saying this post does not exist and a status code of 200 404, which means not found. And here status code of 200, which means okay, is going to be sent. So let's just save this and try to run this code, or try to test this API endpoint in the Postman software. So let's take note of the URL. It is update-post. So let's head back to Postman and create a new tab. We're going to need to copy the base URL. So I'm just going to paste that URL here, and I'll put /update post. And here I'm going to select the put HTTP request method. Now remember that I said we are going to need to send not only the ID, but the new content and the new title and the new content. That is if we want to update the title and the content. So what we are going to do is go to body and form data. So in here, the first thing we need to specify is the post ID. So let's say we want to update the content of the first, let's say we want to update the title and content of the second post. So we're going to take note that the ID is 2. So I'm just going to come here, and the ID is going to be 2. And then the title, which we also want to change, we're going to change this from let's say second post to let's say second post changed by client. And then we're also going to change the content of this post. So I'm going to pass in content here, and I am going to say the content of this blog has been changed from Postman. Yeah. Now there's also something we need to take note of. If we try to send this post request as it is right now, this post request is going to give us an error. It's going to give us an error because these fields here, title and content, do not match the fields that we have specified here, which are new title and new content. So these are mistakes that can really make you angry, to be honest. So we need to take note of this little thing. So instead of title, I'm going to say new underscore title and then new underscore content. So let's just make sure that everything matches. Post ID, new title, and new content. So let's try to test these endpoints now to see what it gives us. So let's hit send. Now, once we hit send, you can see that it says this post was successfully updated. And how can we be sure that it was successfully updated? When we go to this get request, this is what it gave us before. But once we now hit send to make that get request again, you can see that the data has been changed from second post to second post changed by client, and the content has been changed to this content of this blog has been changed from Postman. And if we go back to the admin dashboard and refresh, you can see that it has also reflected. So right now, we've written code to be able to create new posts, update new posts, delete new posts. Create post, update post, delete post, and what's the last one? Update post and retrieve post. So our API is working perfectly well, and we can update posts, we can get each post, we can delete the post, we can create a post, and we can retrieve all the posts. And we can do all that from Postman. And this is what we have done today in this video. If you have had, or if you have any question, if you have been confused about anything that we talked about, you can leave a question in the description, in the comment section rather, and I will reply. Please kindly like, share, subscribe, come back for more. And if you have any question and if you want to get the code to this course, there's going to be a link in the description that will take you to my GitHub where you can get all the code. So I am guessing that is all we need to write for today. In this video, you learned how to build an API from scratch, and you learned how to interact with your API using Postman. So thank you for watching this video, guys, and I will see you in the next.